There is a kind of wood that turns the color of old iron when you leave it out in the weather long enough, and this post had been left out for the better part of 40 years. Gray as a storm cloud, checked down its length with cracks you could lay a matchstick in. One end split into a rough 5-fingered claw where a tractor or a fallen limb had finally broken it off at the ground. A loop of barbed wire had grown into its shoulder so long ago that the wood had swallowed the rust, closed over it the way skin closes over a splinter it decides to keep. It weighed more than a post that size had any business weighing. If you knocked on it with your knuckles, it answered back hard and hollow bright, like knocking on a length of pipe. Nobody in Blackjack County looked at a thing like that and saw anything but trash to be piled at the end of a field and burned when the wind laid down. Nobody except a 17-year-old named Etta Mabry, who stood over it that first afternoon in the ditch along Persimmon Draw Road and studied it the way other people study a face they think they recognize. She didn't touch it right away. She just looked long enough that a truck slowed down to see what was wrong with her, and then she crouched, worked her fingers under the broken end, and dragged it up out of the Johnson grass to the little flatbed trailer she'd hitched behind a four-wheeler that was older than she was. She had 11 of them on there already. She was going back for a 12th. Now, before I take you any deeper into this, do me one small kindness, because stories like this one only travel if people carry them. If you've ever had somebody look at what you were holding and tell you it wasn't worth the trouble, tap that like button so this finds the next person who needs to hear it, and then drop the name of the town you're watching from down in the comments, because I like to know where these things land. Some of you are out on roads that look just like Persimmon Draw. I want to hear about it. All right, back to the girl and the pile of ruined posts. The men at Cy Hollis's feed store had a name for her by the end of that first week, and the name was not unkind exactly, only certain. They called her the Hedge Girl on account of what she was hauling, because in that part of Oklahoma the tree those posts had been cut from went by half a dozen names, and every one of them was a little bit of an insult. Bois d'Arc, the old French had called it, bough wood, and the settlers had flattened that down to bow dark and then flattened it further into hedge, because a century back somebody had figured out you could plant the thorny things in a line and grow yourself a fence that a bull couldn't push through and a fire couldn't easily cross. Osage orange, the school book said. Horse apple, the kid said, on account of the ugly green softball-sized fruit it dropped every fall that nothing would eat and everything would trip over. It was a nuisance tree. It dulled chainsaw teeth and bent plowshares and grew crooked as sin. And the only thing anybody in Cotton Hook agreed on about it was that once you'd cut a hedge post and set it in the ground, your great-grandchildren would be leaning on it when you were long gone. That was the joke and the truth of it both. And when Del Prewitt, who ran the biggest cow-calf operation between there and the river and had opinions the way other men had spare change, saw Etta Mabry backing her rickety trailer up to the burn pile behind the old auction barn to load the county's cast-off hedge posts, he leaned against the tailgate of his diesel and said, loud enough to carry, that some people would haul off anybody's trash if you smiled at them right, and that the Mabry place had finally found a crop it could grow. Weeds and worthless wood. The men laughed the way men laugh when the biggest one starts it. Etta didn't answer him. She'd learned young that answering was a way of agreeing you'd been asked. She kept loading. She'd come back to Cotton Hook that spring, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else that was hers. And the place that was hers was 160 acres of red dirt and blackjack oak and one leaning barn her grandfather had raised board by board in the years after the war. Her mother had left that country the first chance she got and had spent the rest of a short life proving you could run from a place, but not from whatever it was that made you want to. When she passed, there'd been an aunt for a while, and then there'd been nobody. And then there'd been a letter from a lawyer in Ardmore saying the farm out on Persimmon Draw had come down to Etta free and clear, along with a great-aunt named Verna Mabry, who came with it and had no intention of going anywhere. So Etta had driven a car that smoked at every stop sign down out of the city and turned in at a mailbox with the paint gone off it, and there on the porch had been a small hard woman of 80-some years shelling beans into a dishpan, who had looked up at her and said, "You've got Emerson's hands," and had gone back to the beans. That was the whole of the welcome. It was more than Etta had expected. Verna wore a man's work shirt and rubber boots and a straw hat gone soft with age, and she wore them without 1 ounce of self-consciousness, because she had spent 70 years earning the right to be looked at any way she pleased and had stopped caring somewhere around the 5th decade. She spoke about as often as the weather changed, but when she spoke, it went in and stuck like a splinter of that same hard wood, and Etta, who had grown up in the noise of other people's certainty, found that she could listen to a woman like that all day. The place was poor, and it was not empty. That was the first thing Etta learned walking it. There was the barn, silvered and sagging but square where it counted, its beams the size of railroad ties. There was a hedgerow gone wild along the whole east line, planted by some Mabry 100 years dead, thorned and impassable and dropping its ugly fruit. There was Emerson Mabry's shop off the back of the barn, untouched since the day he died, cobwebbed and cold, a workbench worn to a shine, and tools hung on nails in the exact shape of the hand that had left them there. And there was, in a coffee can on that bench, furred with dust, a small ledger with brass corners and a leather cover cracked like the bottom of a dry pond. Etta found it the second week. She was not looking for anything. She was only touching what her grandfather had touched, the way you do in a house full of a person you never met. She opened the ledger, and inside it, in a cramped and patient pencil, was a man's whole life of paying attention. Rows of dates, which trees leafed out first in a cold spring, which cow bred back and which didn't, and pages, more than anything else, about wood. Bodark cut in the dark of the moon in December. Bodark left in the log 2 full years before splitting. The weight of a green post against the weight of a seasoned one. And near the back, underlined twice so hard the pencil had nearly gone through the paper, a single line that Etta read out loud to the empty shop without knowing yet that it would be the truest sentence anybody ever handed her. Bodark don't rot. It waits. She carried the ledger up to the house and put it on the kitchen table between them and asked Verna what it meant. The old woman looked at it a good while before she touched it, and when she did, she laid one finger flat on the cover, the way you'd lay a hand on the shoulder of somebody you'd loved. Emerson could see what a tree was going to be, she said, not what it was going to be. She told Etta then, in pieces over the course of that supper and a dozen after it, about the man who had planted nothing he would live to harvest and had cut nothing he did not first study for a season, and about the wood itself, which the whole county threw on the fire and which Emerson Mabry had known, and his father before him had known, was among the hardest and most beautiful and longest-lived woods that grew anywhere on the continent. It didn't rot. Termites broke their jaws on it. Set in the ground, it outlasted concrete and steel. And underneath that ugly, weathered gray skin, if you cut into it, it was the color of a sunset, a deep flaming orange that aged over years into a brown as rich as old whiskey. People burned it, Verna said, and shrugged, the way you'd shrug at a thing too foolish to argue with, because it was easier than understanding it. Then she pushed back her chair and went to bed, and Etta sat a long time with the ledger open under the one bulb, listening to the cicadas grind away in the dark, and something in her had gone very still and very sure. She did not tell anybody what she meant to do, partly because she was not entirely certain herself, and partly because she had already learned that a plan spoken out loud in Cottonhook was a plan handed over to be judged. What she did instead was collect. That whole first summer, while the town formed its opinion of her, she drove Persimmon Draw and the section roads that branched off it, and everywhere a fence line had rotted, which was to say the pine and the cedar and the steel, but never the hedge, she found the Bodark posts left standing alone or thrown in the ditch, the survivors, the ones the newer wood had died around. Farmers were glad to be rid of them. A broken hedge post was a splinter in the finger of a hayfield, murder on a mower blade. And when a girl came asking would they mind if she hauled off that old pile, they waved her at it and went in to tell it as a joke at supper. Del Prewitt let her take 200 feet of downed hedge fence off his back 40 and told Cy Hollis at the feed store that he'd finally found a use for the girl, which was a free trash service. And Cy, who was a kinder man than his customers, said maybe so and rang up Del's minerals and didn't laugh along, which people noticed. By August, the ground around the old barn on the Mabry place was stacked with gray posts sorted by length and thickness, the way her grandfather had sorted everything, and Etta had filled 40 pages of a notebook of her own and had not made one dime and had not tried to. What she was doing was learning the wood, because she had understood something reading Emerson's ledger that the whole rest of the county had spent 100 years failing to understand, which was that the value was never in the post. The post was just the shape the value happened to be wearing. Inside every one of those ruined gray fence posts was a piece of the hardest, prettiest, most weatherproof timber in North America, already cut, already seasoned by a decade or 4 out in the open, already paid for by somebody long ago, and simply waiting, exactly as the old man had written, waiting for one person patient enough to see past the skin of the thing. She taught herself to read a post from the outside, to know by the ring of it and the pattern of its checks whether the heart inside was sound or gone punky. And she taught herself to run the old shop, oiling the flat belts on her grandfather's bandsaw, learning by ruined blade and bloody knuckle that you could not hurry Bodark, that it would take an edge off a tool the way weather takes paint, that it laughed at a dull blade and only answered to a sharp and patient one. She burned through a season's worth of saw blades. She learned to cut slow, and the first thing she ever made, in the cold shop that October, with the horse apples thudding down outside, was a single cutting board no bigger than a Bible from the swallowed wire post, the very first one she'd dragged up out of the ditch, sawing wide of the old barbed wire, so that the finished board carried a single dark seam through its middle, where the tree had grown around the iron and made the iron part of itself. When she sanded it down and rubbed it with mineral oil, and the deep sunset color came up out of the gray, glowing there under her hands like something lit from inside, she sat down on her grandfather's stool and did not move for a while. Verna came out to the shop to see what had gone quiet. She turned the board over twice in her old hands, ran a thumb down that dark seam, and said only, "There it is," and handed it back. It was the highest praise Etta ever got from her, and Etta knew it, and kept that board, and never sold it. That winter she made more. She had no market and no notion of one. She simply could not stop, the way you can't stop turning over a good stone once you've seen the underside. She made cutting boards and bread boards, the wood glowing orange going to amber. She made the handles for a set of kitchen knives, and the wood outlasted her worry that it would crack. She made a low 3-legged stool of pegged Bodark that you could not have broken with a truck. And every piece carried the story of the post it had been, the checks and the wire scars and the old nail holes she chose to leave, because she had decided early, and without ever quite putting it in words, that she would not hide what the wood had been through, that the 40 years and the weather were not a flaw to be sanded away, but the whole reason the thing was worth having. Anybody could buy new wood. Nobody else in the world had this exact gray post that had held a Mabry fence and swallowed a strand of a neighbor's wire, and stood through the drought years and the ice storm of the 50s, and come at last, unrotted, into the hands of a girl who could see what it was going to be. By spring the shop shelf was full, and the pasture was still stacked with gray posts, and the town still called her the hedge girl, and Del Prewitt still had his joke, and Etta Mabry loaded 8 cutting boards into a cardboard box and drove into Cotton Hook to see if a single soul would give her $1 for what she'd made, which is where the story turns, though nobody standing on that sidewalk knew it yet. Cy Hollis let her set a folding card table out front of the feed store on a Saturday, because Cy was a soft touch and because his wife had died the winter before, and a young person's foolishness in his parking lot was better than the quiet. Etta laid out the 8 boards on a clean flour sack towel and sat behind them on the pegged Bodark stool. And for the better part of 2 hours nothing happened except that men she knew and men she didn't slowed their trucks to look and drove on. And 1 or 2 came up close enough to lift a board and turn it over and set it down with the careful, faintly embarrassed motion of a person putting back a thing they can't understand the price of. She'd marked them at $40 apiece, which the feed store men found hilarious, $40 for a piece of a fence post, and Del Prewitt, coming out with a sack of mineral over his shoulder, stopped at her table and picked up the wire-seamed second board and held it up to the light and pronounced, kindly, the way a man delivers a mercy, that she seemed like a bright enough girl, and that somebody ought to tell her the truth before she wasted her whole youth on it. And the truth was that hedge was hedge, that you could dress it up all you wanted, and that this right here, this whole idea, this leads exactly nowhere. He set the board down. He said a fool, and his Saturdays are soon parted, and he laughed, and 2 men by the propane tank laughed with him, and he got in his truck. And I want you to hold on to that sentence he said, the one about how this leads exactly nowhere. Because a man had just handed a 17-year-old girl the precise shape of the thing her whole life was about to spend itself disproving, and he had done it, as men like that always do, absolutely certain he was doing her a favor. The woman who bought the first board was not from Cotton Hook. Her name was Laura Lee Fitch, and she worked the register at the Sinclair out on the highway, which meant she was, in the ecology of that county, the single most connected human being alive, for everyone stopped for gas, and everyone talked to Laura Lee, and everyone told Laura Lee more than they'd tell a priest. She'd come by the feed store for chicken scratch, and she'd stopped at the card table the way she stopped at everything, out of a professional interest in other people's business, and she'd picked up the wire-seamed board and gone still in a way that Laura Lee Fitch was almost never still. She turned it to the light, and the amber came up. "What's this line?" she asked, running her red thumbnail down the dark seam, and Etta told her, plain, that it was a strand of barbed wire the tree had grown around 40 years back, on the fence between the Mabry place and the Prewitt place, and that she'd sawed the board out around it. Laura Lee looked at the board a while longer. She looked at the girl. She said, "You're Emerson Mabry's grandbaby," and Etta said she was. And Laura Lee nodded slowly, as if that settled a question that had been bothering her, and she paid the full $40 in worn bills out of the pocket of her work vest and carried that board to her car, cradled in both arms like a casserole. And by Monday morning, half the county that filled up at the Sinclair had heard about the girl out on Persimmon Draw who was making $40 cutting boards out of the trash hedge posts, and how there was one with a piece of the old Prewitt fence wire running right through the heart of it, and how you'd think it'd be ugly, but it wasn't. It was the prettiest thing Laura Lee Fitch had seen come out of that country in 20 years. And had you seen the color of it, no, you had to hold it. There was no describing the color of it. Word of mouth is a slow fire and a sure one. It does not spike. It smolders along the ground and jumps where you don't expect it. And it cannot be bought and cannot be hurried and cannot, once it truly catches, be put out by any amount of a man like Del Prewitt saying a thing was worthless. Through that summer they came out to the farm, 1 truck and then 2, because a card table on a Saturday was not enough anymore, and Etta had stopped taking the boards to town and started letting the town come to her. She cleaned out a stall in the old barn and set a plank across 2 sawhorses and laid her work on it, and people drove down Persimmon Draw and turned in at the faded mailbox and got out and stood in the barn her grandfather had built and picked up boards and stools and handles and turned them in the light, and the light came in slantwise through the gaps in the old siding and lit the sawdust hanging in the air, and the wood glowed. She sold a cutting board to a cattle buyer from Fort Worth who'd heard about it at a sale barn and driven 90 miles. She sold a set of 4 to a woman furnishing a lake house who paid without blinking and asked could she get 8 more. She raised her prices not because anyone told her to, but because she kept selling out before noon, which is the only honest reason to ever raise a price, and $40 became 60, and 60 became 90, and still they came, and still she could not make them fast enough, working slow the way the wood demanded, refusing to rush a cut and ruin a heart, keeping every scar and every nail hole and telling every buyer the true history of the post their board had been. That was the thing in the end that they were buying, more than the wood even. They were buying a piece of a fence that had stood through everything and refused to rot. They were buying the story of the survivor. By the second autumn, Etta Mabry had done a thing that the men at the feed store found genuinely difficult to fit inside their heads, which was that she had run out of trash. She had cleaned the ditches of Persimmon Draw and the burn piles of half the county, and the free supply of 40-year gray posts, the cast-offs, the survivors nobody had wanted, had begun to dry up because people had started to understand there was money in the ugly wood and had stopped, sheepishly, offering to let her haul it off. Now, they wanted to sell it. Del Prewitt himself, who 2 summers back had let her take 200 feet of downed hedge fence for the joke of it, found himself in the position of a man who had thrown away something valuable in front of witnesses. And Del Prewitt was not a man who enjoyed that position. He did not come to the barn. He was too proud for the barn. What he did instead, one October evening at the Sinclair, was mention to Lorilei Fitch in a roundabout way that he had a good quarter-mile of old hedge fence down along his creek that a person could have for the right price. And he let Lorilei carry that to Etta the way Lorilei carried everything. And Etta listened to the message and set a fair price in her notebook and sent word back through the same channel that she'd take the sound posts at $1 a foot and cull the rest. And Del Prewitt, who had once called it worthless to her face on a public sidewalk, took the money and never quite looked her in the eye at the feed store again. And that was the closest thing to an apology that a man like Del had in him, which is to say it was a real one paid in cash without a single word of it spoken aloud. She hired the Rusk boy that winter, a rangy 16-year-old named Toby who couldn't sit still in a classroom to save his soul, but who could sort a pile of hedge posts by ring and sound after 2 days of watching her do it, and who took to the old band saw like he'd been born reaching for it. She paid him honest and taught him everything, the way Emerson's ledger had taught her, and she started a ledger of her own with brass corners she'd found in the drawer because she had begun to understand that she was not just making cutting boards, she was learning a body of knowledge that the whole modern world had thrown on the fire, and that somebody after her would need it written down. The barn grew a proper shop out of the old stall. She and Toby laid a plank floor over the dirt and ran power out from the house and hung lights, and still she would not borrow a dime to do any of it, would not let the bank or anybody else own 1 board foot of what she was building, but did it the way the wood itself was made, slowly, out of what the season gave her, 1 post and 1 sail, and 1 careful cut at a time. Verna watched all of it from the porch with the level, unsurprised attention of a woman who had seen a great deal and expected to see more. She did not offer advice, and she did not need to. But now and again she would come down to the shop in her rubber boots and stand in the sawdust and pick up a finished piece and turn it over, and if she said, "There it is," Etta knew the piece was right, and if she said nothing and set it down, Etta knew to cut it up and start again. And between the two of them not 50 words a week were spoken, and it was the fullest conversation Etta had ever been part of in her life. The chef came in the spring of the 3rd year, and after the chef nothing was small anymore. Her name was Marisol Vega, and she ran a restaurant in Oklahoma City that people drove from 3 states to eat at. And she had bought second-hand, at an estate sale of all places, a Bodark cutting board with a dark wire seam through the heart of it. The very board Lorilei Fitch had bought first, and had, it turned out, left to a niece who did not understand what she had. And Marisol Vega had understood the instant she picked it up. She had turned that board over in her hands the way everyone did and had found burned small into the underside. A mark Etta had started using, a little brand of a fence post with a strand of wire through it, and under it 3 words, because Etta had taken to burning her grandfather's line into the back of everything she made, "Bodark don't rot." Marisol tracked the mark to the county and the county to the road and the road to the barn, and she came out to Persimmon Draw in a car that had never seen red dirt before. And she did not haggle and she did not condescend. She just walked the shop slowly touching everything, and then she asked Etta if she would build the tables, not cutting boards. The tables, all of them, the bar top 40 feet long, the whole dining room of a restaurant people flew in to eat at, out of the survivor wood, out of the county's burned-off trash, and she would pay what it cost and wait however long it took, because she had understood, standing in that barn, the thing Emerson Mabry had written in pencil and underlined twice, that there was nothing else in the world quite like it, and that the story of where it came from was worth more than any lumber ever milled. It took Etta and Toby the better part of a year to build the tables for Marisol Vega, and Etta would not let it go faster, and Marisol did not ask her to. And when the restaurant reopened with a 40-foot bar top of amber and whiskey-brown Bodark, the grain shot through with the black seams of old fence wire and the pale scars of 100-year nail holes, every board of it hand-finished so the sunset color came up glowing under the low lights. The story ran in a city magazine and then a bigger one, and the phone at the Mabry place, which had for 3 years mostly rung with wrong numbers, began to ring with architects and designers and a furniture buyer from a company back east whose name even Toby Rusk had heard of. And here's the thing that the men at the feed store, some of whom had begun coming out to the barn now, quietly, on Saturdays, to lean in the doorway and marvel and take a certain sideways ownership of a local legend, here is the thing they never fully understood about what happened next, which is that Etta Mabry said no to almost all of it. She said no to the furniture company that wanted to license her mark and put a factory version of her boards in 1,000 stores, because she knew a factory could not read a post by its ring and would only sand the scars away and hide the wire and sell people the lie of new wood dressed up old. She said no to the man who offered to fund a big shop and a crew of 20 on the strength of the demand, because debt was a fence you built around yourself, and she had spent her life learning that the only fence worth a thing was the kind that outlasted the man who said it. She grew exactly as fast as the survivor wood would let her grow, and not one post faster, and she let the wanton pull it forward instead of pushing it with borrowed money, the same way she had done everything since the first gray post in the ditch, and the town watched a young woman turn down more money than most of them would see in a lifetime. And slowly, one by one, they stopped calling her the hedge girl. Verna Mabry died in the winter of the 4th year, in her own bed, in her rubber boots because she'd been out to the shop that morning to stand in the sawdust one last time, which nobody knew was the last time until it was. She had turned over the piece Etta was working, a long, low bench of pegged Bodark meant for the entryway of a house Etta would never see, and she had run her old thumb down the grain, and she had said, "There it is," and she had walked back up to the house through the cold and lain down and not gotten up. Etta found the ledger afterward, her grandfather's ledger with the brass corners, moved from the coffee can where it had sat for years to the middle of Verna's kitchen table, squared up neat, with a scrap of paper marking the page where Emerson had underlined the line twice. She never knew for certain whether Verna had put it there for her to find, or had simply been reading it herself at the end, sitting alone in the kitchen with her brother's handwriting, and she decided it did not matter, that both things were the same thing, which was the past handing itself forward to be used. She buried the old woman in the family plot at the corner of the east hedgerow in the shade of the wild osage trees some Mabry a century dead had planted, and she sat at the head of the grave, in place of stone, a squared post of Bodark with Verna's name and years burned into it deep, because she knew, the way she knew few things so completely, that the wood would still be standing there sharp and legible long after any granite in that county had weathered smooth, that it would not rot, that it would only wait, the way it always had, the way the old man had promised. And there was a comfort in that she could not have explained to anybody who had not spent 4 years learning to read a fence post like a face. The barn that everyone came to see in the end was not the old leaning one, though that one still stood and still smelled of sawdust and oil, and still had the wire-seamed first board hanging on the wall over Emerson's untouched bench where Etta had hung it and would never sell it. The barn people meant, when they said, "Had you seen the Mabry girl's barn?" was the new one she raised in the 5th year at the top of the rise where you could see it from Persimmon Draw Road, and she raised it the way she had done everything, slow and paid for, and out of the very wood the county had once burned. Its posts were Bodark, the great survivor posts, the biggest and soundest she and Toby had pulled from 4 years of fence lines, set in the ground the way Emerson set his, in the dark of a December moon, to stand for 200 years. Its beams were Bodark. Its wide doors were faced with boards that glowed amber in the afternoon light and carried, every one, the dark seams and the nail holes and the honest scars of what they had been. It was not a big barn by the standard of a man like Del Prewitt, but it was a barn built entirely of the thing an entire county had been certain was worthless, standing up on a hill in plain sight, unpainted, because paint would have been a lie and Bodark needs no protecting from anything the weather can do. And when the last beam went up, Toby Rusk drove into Cotton Hook and mentioned to Laura Lee Fitch that folks might want to come have a look, and folks did. They came out on a Sunday afternoon, most of the county at one time or another that first month, and they stood at the bottom of the rise and looked up at a barn built out of their own thrown-away fence posts, glowing gold in the low sun. And there was a particular kind of quiet that came over people who had spent years being certain about a thing and were now looking at the shape of how wrong they had been. Cy Hollis came and stood a long time and told Etta that his late wife would have loved to see it, and Etta gave him a small cutting board she'd been saving, the amber deep in it, and would not take his money. And Del Prewitt came, last of anybody, on an evening when he thought the place would be empty, in his diesel truck, and he sat in it at the bottom of the rise for a good while before he got out. He was an older man now than he had been on the sidewalk that day, and some of the certainty had gone out of him the way it goes out of everyone if they live long enough, and he walked up the hill in the gold light and stood at the door of a barn made from wood he had once, in front of witnesses, called trash that led exactly nowhere, and he did not make a large production of it. He put one big hand flat on a doorpost, on the deep whiskey-brown grain of it, the way you'd lay a hand on a horse to let it know you were there. He said, "That fence along my creek, my granddad set that." He said, "I never once looked at it." And Etta Mabry, who was standing in the doorway of the barn her family's patience had built, understood that this was the whole of what the man had come to say, and that it had cost him more to say it than all the money he'd ever made, and she did not make him say any more. She told him his granddad had set it in good wood. She told him it hadn't rotted. She told him it had just been waiting, which was true of the fence and true of the wood, and true, she thought but did not say, of a great many things and a great many people that the world in its hurry decides too soon aren't worth the trouble. Del Prewitt nodded and took his hand off the post and looked at the mark it had left, which was nothing, because Bodark does not mark, and he went back down the hill in the failing light. And after that, when her name came up at the feed store, his was the first voice to say she'd been right, and he said it plainly. And that was the end of the joke in Blackjack County forever. Etta Mabry is not old even now, though the barn on the rise has weathered from gold to deep brown the way the wood always does, aging into something richer than it started. She still works slow. She still keeps a notebook, several of them now, filling with the same patient attention her grandfather kept, Everything she has learned about reading a post by its ring and cutting a heart without ruining it and drying the wood. The years the wood demands, all of it written down in pencil for whoever comes next, because she has understood from the beginning that she is only a link in a chain of Mabris who could see what a tree was going to be. Toby Rusk is a grown man and a master of the craft, and there are 2 younger ones now learning at the bandsaw, and the pieces that come out of the barn on Persimmon Draw go into houses and restaurants all over the country, and every single one of them still carries the honest scars of the fence it used to be and the brand burned small into the back, a fence post with a strand of wire through it, and under it the 3 words. She never grew it faster than the wood would grow. She never borrowed against tomorrow. She let the wanton pull it, 1 post and 1 cut and 1 true story at a time. And it made her, by any measure, a man like Del Prewitt would once have used, wealthy, though that was never the thing, and she'd tell you it was never the thing, and you would believe her if you stood in that barn in the afternoon light. And sometimes, on a Sunday, she still drives Persimmon Draw slow with the windows down, and when she passes a fence line where the pine and the cedar and the steel have rotted and fallen, and only the gray hedge posts still stand, alone, unbroken, waiting out in the weather exactly as they have for 100 years, she slows the truck and she looks at them a long beat before she drives on, the way she looked at the very first one in the ditch, and she smiles, because she knows what's under the gray. She always knew. That was the only thing she ever really did that the rest of them couldn't. She looked longer than they were willing to look. So if you've made it all this way with me down that red dirt road, here's what I'll ask of you before you go. If you know somebody, and I think you do, who has been told that what they're holding, the thing they love or the work they're quietly good at or the plain overlooked stuff of their own life, isn't worth the trouble and leads exactly nowhere, then send them this story, because sometimes a person just needs to hear about a girl and a pile of broken fence posts to keep looking a little longer at their own gray wood. Down in the comments, tell me about a time somebody underestimated you or something you saw the worth of when nobody else did, because I read them, all of them, every single one. And those are the stories that keep me going. And do me that one last favor from the start of all this, and tell me where you're watching from, the town, the county, the country, the road that looks like Persimmon Draw, because I truly do like to know where a story like this comes to rest. And out there tonight, somewhere close to you, I'd bet money there's an old hedge post standing alone in a fallen fence line, hard as iron, gray as a storm, waiting on the one person patient enough to see the sunset that's still burning inside it. Bodark don't rot. It waits. And so it turns out, does everything worth having. And I'll tell you one more small thing before I let this road go quiet, because it stayed with me longer than the money and the magazines and the 40-foot bar top ever did. There is a girl out on Persimmon Draw now, 10 years old, maybe 11, one of the ones learning at the bandsaw, and nobody is quite sure who she is exactly, only that she started turning up on Saturdays the way stray attention turns up around anything true, and that Etta let her stay the way Verna once let a smoking city car turn in at a faded mailbox and never asked it to leave. That girl is taken to walking the ditches. She goes out alone on the evenings when the light lies down gold across the red dirt, and she comes back dragging pieces of gray wood taller than she is. And she has begun, without anybody teaching her the words for it, to stand over a broken post a long beat before she touches it, studying it the way you study a face you think you recognize. Etta watched her do it one evening from the door of the new barn and did not call out or correct her or hurry her along. She just watched, and something moved in her chest that she did not try to name, because she had seen it before, that particular stillness, in her grandfather's ledger and in Verna's old hands, and in her own 17-year-old shadow bent over the first ruined post in the Johnson grass. And she understood that the chain had found its next link the way it always finds it, not through anybody's plan, but through patience recognizing patience across the years. The wire-seamed board still hangs over Emerson's untouched bench, and it has darkened another shade toward whiskey, and the black seam of the old pre-wit fence runs through its heart the way it always did. And Etta has left instructions, written in pencil in a ledger with brass corners, that it is never to be sold and never to be moved, that it is the first true thing this place ever made and the proof of everything after, and that whoever stands in that shop when she is gone should hang it exactly where it hangs and let the young ones ask about it and tell them the whole plain story, the ditch and the mockery and the man who called it worthless, so that they will know a thing worth knowing, which is that the world is generous with its certainty and stingy with its attention, and that the difference between the two is where every overlooked fortune on this earth is quietly waiting to be found. Out past the window, the hedgerow her great-great-grandfather planted still stands thorned and impassable and dropping its ugly fruit, still doing the one patient job it was set to do 100 years before anybody now living drew breath, and the posts he cut from it are somewhere out there yet, hard as iron under their gray, holding lines that fell down around them decades ago. They are still waiting. They will outwait us all. And the only thing Annie Mabry ever did, the only trick to the whole of it, was to walk up slow and look a good while longer than the rest of the world was willing to look and see the sunset still burning under the storm.